Prof, thank you so much for joining us. When we look at the damage to learning, I would imagine year two, with kids who went through it all last year and now have to continue this year, it's starting to become quite a cumulative effect.
Most definitely. So we actually now have learning assessment data that shows the levels of the learning loss that children have experienced in South Africa. And in 2020, it was between 50 to 75% of a year of learning that children lost. And obviously, because rotational timetables continued this year, where only 50% of kids attend on any one day, it's safe to say, I think it's a very reasonable and sobering assumption that children have basically lost a year of learning. So the average grade 3 student in 2021 now knows the same as the average grade 2 student from 2019. That's very serious.
Yeah, and listening to education authorities, they sound almost panicky. And in fact, I think that is a word that Panyaza Lesufi used today, the education MEC here in Gauteng, about how people are feeling about education. Because particularly in Gauteng, we're seeing very sharp numbers rising. We've already got at least 20 schools in the province closed down because of outbreaks of COVID-19. But yet we also know that there are vaccines coming on Friday specifically for teachers, which will hopefully mean that our teachers will be able to stay in class. Do you think that's enough to keep learning on track?
I think it is. It's a positive development that the vaccines are available, will become available for teachers. It's important to note, however, that we don't think that schools are big sites of transmission. So when we look at teacher excess deaths from last year, using teacher payroll data, some of the work by Martin Gustafsson has shown that the opening or closing dates of schools have no relationship to the excess deaths of teachers. So while there have been excess deaths amongst teachers, they follow the trends of the overall population. They're not at higher risk for their age group relative to the general population. And we know that children, less than 0.5% of the deaths in the country have been from children.
I think the fear of many parents is that their kids, who, as you say, are unlikely to get COVID in any serious way, will come home with COVID and pass it on to vulnerable members of the family. I'm wondering if that's a valid concern, perhaps a good reason to, if not close schools, but start to move back into rotational learning.
So remember that for most schools, rotational learning never stopped. It was only in fee-charging schools, in Model C schools and private schools, where all children went back to school. In almost at least 80% of schools, rotational timetables are still in practice, where only 50% of kids attend school on any one day. So I think that the fears that parents have, the ones that you've mentioned, that children might catch COVID at school and bring it home to parents, there's some research internationally that shows that that is a very rare instance of adults catching from children as opposed to the other way around. But it is a legitimate concern, and it's not one that we can say conclusively it can't happen. But I think that a lot of parents are also very concerned about their children and their life prospects based on the severe learning losses that these children are having and the lack of school meals that they're getting from not being able to go to school.
And of course, yes, you're quite right that most government schools are still on the rotation, but we do know a lot of the big schools here in Gauteng. I'm thinking, for example, of Cares, which is a government school, that has been back full-time for some while now. But there's also the plan later in July to go back to full-time learning. Bearing in mind, and I've just spoken to Professor Bruce Malado, who says they reckon that the height of the third wave in Gauteng is going to be sort of end June, early July. Do you think it's unrealistic to think that schools will be back in full force by the end of July?
I think some of that depends on the speed of the vaccinations. For example, whether teachers are vaccinated or not according to the government schedule. A lot of the timelines that we get told from government, that they don't actually stick to those timelines for lots of reasons. Some of the things that are out of their control and some of the things that are within their control, but they don't have the capacity to implement their own plans. But I think if teachers are all vaccinated by the end of July, and if the wave is on its way down by then I see no reason why we wouldn't go back to school, given the serious, I don't think many people in South Africa realize the severe costs to the 13 million children that should be in school, and for at least half of them, they're not.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that getting back to school is one thing, and then recouping that lost learning is another. Are there clear interventions to do that? Because surely what it will mean is having children, say, at Saturday classes or at winter schools to try and cram that knowledge back into their brains.
So this is the notion of catch-up. That it's possible to catch up some of the losses that have been made. And at the moment, there are no credible plans as to how we would catch up at least the year of learning that's been lost. Some of the projections by various people are saying that we are likely to get back to pre-pandemic levels of learning outcomes in 2030. So in nearly 10 years' time, it will take us to catch up this. And that's only if you don't have additional losses that happened in 2021, so it's possibly even longer than 2030. But I think at the moment we haven't heard credible plans around any of the things that you've mentioned: afternoon, evening classes, tutors, Saturday schools, winter schools. All of those things, when it's done en masse for the entire schooling system, require the buy-in of teachers and teacher unions and additional resources to do that. And at the moment, those don't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for laying it on the line for us. That was Professor Nic Spaull, Senior Researcher at Stellenbosch University, also, of course, part of the NIDCRAM surveys, which have looked into the impact of the pandemic.